So my name's Famila Rahman. I'm from Tiffinwelly CIC South Asian Heritage Food Project. The date today is 19th March 2022 and the time is 12:13 and I'm with participant Shaheed Mahmood. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So firstly, were you born in the UK?
No, so I came to the UK in 1971. I was 2 years old, so I can't remember it very well.
Okay.
It was early 70s, and I came to a place called Stoke Newington.
What was your heritage? Like where did your family come from?
Okay, so my family is from Pakistan, originally India. So after partition, Pakistan, and my father was from a small village called Sanghoi, which is about 5 miles from a city called Jhelum, and Jhelum is the smallest city of Pakistan. And so my mother is from Jhelum, and my father is from Sanghoi, and he was 25 years older than her. Yes.
Okay, and so you first came to the UK, you came to Stoke Newington. Could you just tell me a bit about what Stoke Newington was like?
Well, I was very, very young, but Stoke Newington at that particular time didn't have much of a Jewish community, as far as I can remember. I know that Aldgate East, where we moved later on, had a bigger Jewish community, and they were slowly moving towards the Stoke Newington area. And in my early life, I remember that coming to study in Whitechapel. So we moved quite quickly, and we ended up in a place just off the Petticoat Lane Market, which has got some wonderful memories as well. So, and I was age 4, and we lived in a basement flat, which we shared with a few other people and a few rats, and it was an interesting experience. And then from there we settled in Tower Hamlets for a period of time, and the experiences were quite strange. I mean, I was very young, and I saw what you could only describe as blatant racism at the time. In the 1970s, it was really on your face, so you couldn't get away from it. And my mother, who had never worked formally, I mean, she obviously had worked in Pakistan, cleaning people's dishes and things like that, cleaning plates, because what happened is she had some difficulties with my father in the past, and so ended up leaving him, and then she married again, and then my stepfather actually brought me over to the UK, so it was my stepfather. So when we arrived in the UK, it was quite difficult. Schooling was very difficult. But I know that she started working in the rag trade and then ended up in the restaurant trade.
Okay.
So that's why it sort of links up with this particular project, sort of links up to her experiences. So she was the first lady chef in the South Asian restaurant trade.
And where did she work? Like which restaurant?
So she started off in a small restaurant in Brick Lane. And the restaurant was, I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but it was a corner restaurant, and it would have pictures of very big Pakistani wrestlers within it. And it had this juke machine, and you would go in and you could play classic music from Elvis Presley and Beethoven or whatever, and suddenly you can play Muhammad Rafi on the same machine. So it was fascinating. And it would have all these pictures of very, very big wrestlers. The wrestling fraternity in Pakistan was very, very big. You got people like Gama Palwan, who is the father of one of the, or father-in-law of one of the ex-prime ministers of Pakistan. So Gama Palwan was known as, he was one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. He 54 fights, never lost.
And what kind of food did the restaurant serve?
This food was, so you see what happened is the food that used to be served in Pakistani and Indian restaurants in the main used to be cooked by Bengali communities. And that's still the case now. So you go into, you can't find many authentic Pakistani Indian restaurants because it's cooked by the Bengali communities in the main. So she was one of the main Pakistani cooks who cooked in a Pakistani restaurant. So the food that she would cook, we would be there for 4 to 5 in the morning. So the traditional dish is we would make puris. So these are made with flour and lots of oil, and halwa, which is made with semolina. And that would be the staple diet of most people. And the most of the people who would come would be the workers who are working in the rag trade, who would come to the restaurant in the morning, so they had their breakfast. And in the afternoon, it would be very simple dishes such as naan keema, it would be katlama, it would be chicken curry or something like that. And it was probably even before the advent of all these wonderful names that we've given to the dishes that are available in Indian restaurants. So I can't remember seeing a dough piazza or anything like that. It was just basic stuff, but it was wonderful to have that. And so at the age of 5, I remember leaving school and going to the restaurant and waiting for my mum. And then as I grew up, the 6 weeks holidays, I used to help my mum do the washing up in the restaurants, which was it was fascinating in some ways. I made lots of friends. I got told off a lot, lots of mistakes, but it was a good experience.
Okay, so can you tell me a bit about the people that used to come in? Did you have particular relationships with some of the people, or?
Yeah, some of the people who would come in would be what you would term regular, so regular people. It's like a cafe, more or less. So they're coming in, and I remember at one particular stage that the restaurant that she was working by that time was a place called Shazan, and it was right opposite what used to be the old Naz cinema. So in the 70s and 80s, when people came over from India and Pakistan, they always wanted to go somewhere together, and the togetherness happened at the cinema. So they would turn up at Naz cinema, maybe on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, and you would get to watch 2 films for the price of 1. And the great thing was that most people would either go to the restaurant before going to the cinema, or they would go straight afterwards, or some people would during intervals, they would go to the restaurant, take all the food and take it back to the cinema, which is not allowed nowadays. But in those days, people used to do that. So we had a mixture of people, but what we found is that the communities were made up of mainly South Asian people, so India, Pakistan, what was then Bangladesh, and became Bangladesh, so East Pakistan before that. And then you would have different communities come in from time to time, like the Ugandan community in the 1970s, then you've got the Kenyan communities, then people from Malawi. So you had like a big mix of people who all wanted to get what was the authentic Pakistani or Indian dish. And I think, personally, I think it was a bit more authentic then than it is now, because we see a lot of fusion and everything like that now. So it was much more simple food that the people used to have before they left their lands. And they loved that. And I remember one of the biggest food was fish. My mum used to make fish on the Friday, and the people who used to come, they would do their Friday prayers. East London Mosque hadn't been built yet. It was still in a state that it was a porter cabin basically, and the mosque in Brick Lane had just been bought because it used to be a factory owned by the Jewish community. So when we assess all that, so we got the people who would come in and they would do their prayers, and at 1:30, 2 o'clock the prayers are finished. Then they would stand outside our small cafe restaurant waiting for the fish. And sometimes there could be hundreds of people just waiting just for the fish, and it would often run out. But the fish was something they really loved.
So can you tell me a bit about the recipe and the type of fish that it was?
Okay, so the type of fish that it was, I mean, there was always a search to find traditional Pakistani Indian fishes in the UK. It never happened. It was very difficult because in the UK, mainly you would have things like cod or you plaice and things like that. So the nearest we got to that type of fish was probably grey mullet. Grey mullet had the same essential features that some of the fishes of Pakistan and India, and it was quite strong, it was quite hardy. So when you cooked it, it could take the curry and not break up into little pieces. So it had to be a hardy fish. And grey mullet fitted the bill. And and the way it was made is very simple recipes. As in most traditional recipes of Pakistan, you're using tomatoes, you're using coriander, you're using ginger, you're using garlic, a mixture of all those things, oil or butter. You make the sauce, and then you fry the chicken or fry the fish, and suddenly you put the fish at the end into the sauce and serve it. Layered with lots of dhania and coriander and all sort of lovely stuff and mint. And this was the authentic fish, served with either naan bread or actually roti is better, because I think the tandoori roti was much more lighter on the stomach than naan is. That's what I learned from my elders. And it worked. It was wonderful. So it was a very, very big dish of that time. Later on, other dishes took its place, but Friday, I always remember Friday and fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said later on other dishes took its place. What?
Okay, so it depended on people, but the main things we would have something like tandoori chicken, and tandoori chicken became very big. And then we saw lots of people from northern India, North Pakistan, because that was their traditional dishes, and they would start opening restaurants in the local area and in Newham. And so my journey in Newham started in 1976. So I arrived in 1976 in Newham, and my mother kept on working still in Tower Hamlets. And then in 77 she was offered a job working for the first Mobeen restaurant. Before it was even called Mobeen's, it was owned by the brother of Amin is the owner of Mobeen's, and his brother is Salim. It used to be called Salim's, and it was on the Romford Road. And my mother used to be the first cook, so she was the first female cook for Mobeen's, and she would do the same type of dishes, very, very popular dishes, South Asian, Pakistani traditional dishes. And she was the only female cook, and she really did struggle, because what would happen is all the male cooks or the male staff, they made her feel very small, because she was very much a woman in a man's world. So she struggled, and what she was paid a pittance compared to what the men were paid.
How did she sort of cope with that? Like, how did she manage?
I think what it was is that when, like lots of people, when they first come to a country, she found it very, very difficult, and not having English as a language, so she couldn't speak much English, and being a woman, there was lots of elements who were able to exploit her. She was a strong woman because she was in a man's world, and she fought it. But if I think about it now, it wasn't a fight that she should have really had to do. But like a lot of women, particularly from South Asia, who are doing this type of work, she really did struggle. So in many ways, I suppose, she was a pioneer, because she led that struggle, and she survived. She went through it, and I remember one particular day. So she was working in the Brick Lane restaurant, and she was cooking something in oil, and a lot of oil spilled on her arm, and she just kept on working. And then she was taken to the hospital by the owner, who decided it was important, otherwise he might have some problems. So she ended up in hospital, and then I saw her at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and she was cooking for my dad, and she had hid that she had been burnt, because she assumed or presumed that he wouldn't understand. And she was right. He didn't understand, because I think there was a big reliance on her money coming in to support the family. Although my dad was working, he was working as a tailor master. So he used to work in the rag trade, but he would have some days that he didn't have any work, and some days he would, because he would work on a basis which used to be called piecework. So it's paid by the hour or paid by the products that you're making. So sometimes he wouldn't have work, so the reliance was on my mother. And I remember her first wages was about £7 a week, which moved on to about 15. And I remember in the 80s she was earning about £60, compared to her male counterparts who were on about 200. So she really suffered, but she never said anything. She just said, oh, you know, I'm earning something, at least I'm bringing something back. And then in 1980, my father passed away, and so my mother just kept on working, and she would go early in the morning at 4 or 5 o'clock to Aldgate East, cook. Then she would do some work in Mobeen. Wherever she got jobs, she would just do it.
How many restaurants did you work in total?
So normally 2. Sometimes just 1, because she would just concentrate on 1. At the most 3.
So what was the third restaurant that you worked in?
Okay, so she was at Salim's, and they opened up Mobeen, and she worked at Mobeen. And she, at one particular stage in Green Street, if you know that area of Green Street, right in the heart of Newham, there's a place called Anand Pan Centre, and they used to have a restaurant, and she was their first cook as well. So she was, she had worked there as well. She didn't work there that long, but she did work as a cook. And the amazing thing for that is that because that's a vegetarian restaurant, so she was making mainly vegetarian dishes there, and she would make the puris and everything like that. But so she could turn her hand to most things when it came to food.
And the recipes that she cooked in Pananand and various other places, were they her recipes, or were they recipes she learnt from?
No, I think it was recipes that she learnt from her mother. So there was no recipe book given by the restaurant, and there wasn't a head chef of any sort who would say you have to do it like this. So it was from her learning. And remember, she wasn't a chef or a cook in Pakistan, so she hadn't been trained in that way. All she was is from a simple lady, very little education in Pakistan, who used to cook for her family, and suddenly thrown in the deep end in the UK to cook for lots of people.
Wow, amazing. And I guess, so the other sort of things that I wanted to ask you about is, so we've talked a lot about her employment. What about the food that she cooked at home? Was that different?
Yes, I think, when she's cooking on the restaurant, it's a different palette, and it's also a different clientele, if you like. The people who are coming to restaurants wasn't too much different to the cooking that she made at home, but I think generally she might use maybe a bit more chili at home than in a restaurant. But we also have to remember that the vast majority of the people that she actually who were the clients were actually people from Pakistan and India and South Asia, so they're used to the very strong use of the spices and the garlics, and especially the red and black peppers. So they were quite used to that. So if she was working now, she'd probably have to cut down a bit, and she'd have to reduce the red peppers particularly. At home, she reduced it slightly. The style of cooking was obviously, because she was cooking less, so she didn't have to use all the various things. And the other thing is that at home, she would make homemade garam masala. In the restaurant, it was given to her, this is the garam masala that you're using. So the ingredients were quite different. She never used tinned tomatoes at home, but in the restaurant she did. She never used mint in bottles at home. She would get mint from the garden and grind it and make it. And coriander, for example, it wasn't that available. I remember in the 70s, there was just a few Asian shops, particularly in Aldgate, but even in Green Street there was hardly any Asian shops that had that type of thing. So she would get coriander and then grind it herself. Black pepper she would grind herself. You couldn't get packets of ground black pepper at that particular time. But for the restaurants, they would use an electric grinder, and she didn't like electric grinders, so it supposed to taste. So that was the spices and everything like that. She was fascinated with experimenting in a very small way. It wasn't any fusion or anything like that, but she would try different things. So it was more around, oh, I've cooked chicken karai like this, maybe I should cook it slightly differently. And this was, remember, this was before the advent of YouTube and things like that, where people can just go in and just look at, oh, how do we make this particular recipe? It was trial and error, and also word of mouth. So someone would say, her friend or someone would say, oh no, we make it like this, try like this, and she would make it like that. And either she would say, oh, it's better like this, or in most cases she would say, no, my one's better. So it was lots of experience like that, and the word of mouth within our own communities was very, very important. You have to remember, in the 70s when she first came here, she was, and let's look at Aldgate and also look at Newham. So in Aldgate, there was very few people who looked like us and her. So whenever she found people who looked like her, she bonded very, very quickly. She would walk up to them, talk to them, and then the next moment I would realize she's going to their house and talking about their family, and there's linkage, and suddenly they've invited us for food on the Sunday. And it wasn't about any particular religion or anything like that. It was more about being able to speak and understand the same languages and having some sort of understanding with each other. So I think, like most people who are migrants who come to the country, she found some safety in finding her own people around her. And then they would share experiences and they would share food.
And what kind of things did they share? Like, did they have parties? Did they, like, how did they gather, and
yeah,
what
so
did they eat?
you see what it was, at that particular time, there wasn't the real big concept of parties apart from wedding parties. South Asian communities generally weren't too big on birthdays. Nowadays it's a big thing, but at that time it wasn't. But it was more about community parties. Basically every Saturday you just go to your friend's house and share food. And then the following Saturday they might turn up. And if you're off on Sunday, you would do the same. So people either went to the cinema, and they used, in the main, used to go together. So they would phone up or contact each other. And sometimes this was even before people had phones in our house. We didn't have a phone until 1989. So before that, so it would be just contacts. Oh, you're coming around my house, bring your husband, I'll make this. So when she used to go to her friends, particularly from Punjab, who are from, who are from the Sikh tradition, they would make corn flour bread, and they would make a saag, and the saag would be made of mustard, because the traditional way to make saag is mustard. It's not spinach. And then you would add maybe some elements of spinach into it. But the purists would say, no, you don't add any spinach. That's a fusion that came in later. So saag with pure butter or pure ghee and makkei ki roti. That was the Sunday thing. I wasn't a big fan of it, but it was the favorite thing amongst our community. And some very simple things like just masoor dal. Masoor dal is so simple to make and eat, and it overrides all communities. So anyone who's making masoor dal at that particular time, because I was not a big fan of the cornbread, the aunties used to always make me something else, and we would go to their house, and they were like our aunties. They were from different religions. They spoke almost the same language, and their mothers, aunties' mothers, were grandmas, and you would go and talk to them, ask them their opinion. look at them in strange ways, because it was just fascinating to see. Because remember, I was 2, and I had not seen really my own community that much, because I was very, very young. So seeing a different community and them speaking our language, but they got a different religion, was quite unique. But it was fascinating.
Okay, and you sort of mentioned that you didn't particularly like the South. Were there particular foods that you really did like? Like, what were your favourite things?
My
that you
favourite food,
yeah,
of all time, is mincemeat with peas, so keema matar. And I remember it well because, and kebabs, Sikh kebabs. I remember them well because when my mum used to work in the restaurant, those are the food I always used to choose. The owner would come and say, "Oh, what do you want for lunch today?" And I'll say, "Oh, I'll have some Sikh kebab, or I'll have some keema matar." And then I would have it with naan. And then after that, I would just go back to work. I would help my mum. And I remember at 8, up to about 12, maybe 13, I was their waiter as well. I was the waiter in the restaurant. And we see this a lot in South Asia. If you go to South Asian dhaba restaurants, see young children, because they're not getting the education, who work there. So I was one of those kids in the UK. And I'm sure, if the local authorities picked me up, there would be some problems. But often I would not go to school and just help my mum. But on the 6-week holidays particularly, it was so much fun, because I used to get the princely sum of £5 at the end of the week for doing this work. And then I would go and buy some cassettes.
What cassettes?
Okay, so the big thing was that everyone has a hero of that particular time. It was coming to an end of the Rajesh Khanna era, and in came someone who's very, very popular now, and one of the biggest icons of Bollywood cinema, Amitabh Bachchan. So he was huge. He was very, very huge. I remember collecting his photographs, because the cinema was just opposite us, and I would get these postcards with Amitabh Bachchan in this film and that film. I remember old classic films, Kala Patthar, Suhag. Even before that, you had Sholay, like one of the greatest movies India's produced. And I remember going to see that in Mile End in 1975, 76. Mile End Cinema was the cinema that was the big cinema that would have the latest films. The Naz Cinema was similar, but not as big as the Mile End Liberty Cinema, just opposite Mile End Station. So I remember going to see Sholay, and I remember going to see many, many films before that in that particular cinema. But Sholay was the big one because it started at 12 o'clock in midnight, and it didn't finish until 4. It was just really long. And watching it, as it first came out, was a wonderful sort of novelty. And I remember it was fascinating. This was one of the most fascinating films, as far as I can remember, in the history of South Asian filmmaking. Here's a film which is 3.5 hours long, which children from the age of 8 to whatever age, I mean, you had people aged 80 who remember every single dialogue of that film. We used to buy cassettes of that film, not video cassettes, cassettes, and remember it by heart. It was just fascinating. So film played a big part in our culture, in our makeup, in the restaurant trade, in food.
Okay. And back to food and your mum, sort of, do you cook now, and how much are you influenced by her and what you eat?
So I think the rest of my family, particularly my wife, is much more influenced by my mother. Cooking for me didn't start until 2003. So my wife went to Pakistan. I had young children, and I couldn't cook. So I said to her before she goes, can she cook a lot of dishes, and we put them in the freezer. And then when she came back, she tasted her own food from the freezer. She didn't like it. So I decided that I would learn to cook. So I cook a lot of the sort of South Asian dishes, and I experiment with other dishes as well. Influence, yes, I'm sure there's a lot of influence, because She was a very good cook, although she wasn't trained in any way. She was a very good cook, and most of my life I remember seeing her in the kitchen. So the kitchen has shaped me in many ways. So I remember the kitchen being the place where we would have discussions and arguments and talking about things, and her telling me that, you know, I was part of an arranged marriage. It was quite strange because she went to Pakistan in 1984 and came back. So she only went for 2 months, came back and said, by the way, you're engaged. As it's common, isn't it? And it was common at that particular time. So I hadn't seen my prospective wife or anything like that, never seen any pictures. It was just based on trust. If I say he'll do it. I wasn't very happy about it, but in 1989 I went back with her and got married.
Wow.
Yeah, and then my wife was much more influenced by her because my mother controlled the kitchen until she passed away in 2000. So she would cook. She would do all the cooking and everything like that. And my wife would, I wouldn't say learn from her. She would just watch her basically.
Did you ever cook with your mum when you were younger?
I would help out. So my helping out would be like getting the garlic cloves and opening them up, and then getting them ready for my mum. Or the most important thing, I used to do the most important thing, after she's cooked, she would say, taste this, is this okay? And I suppose that's a very important part of the cooking, yes. So that was my thing. But what I like doing is I like cooking fish and chips on Friday or Saturday. So before work, so I started work, it would be Fridays, and then when I started work on Saturdays. So I make some mean fish and chips.
And where did you learn the recipe for that?
Well, I have to be very honest. I didn't learn any recipe. I just went to a local store, which has got the fish fingers already made, and you just make them. And then you make a big deal of something that you've done. And I would always ask, oh, is it good, or is it really, and always want the appreciation. The first dish I made was dal. And I made that when I was probably about 17, 18. I couldn't make anything else, and it just seemed so easy to do because I watched my mum many times. And it's just get some dal, put some water, put a few garlic cloves, and leave it for a little while. And then you put the salt and everything after. And it worked, it was fine. It was typical. I mean, I had to ask everyone, my mother and other people in the family, whether it was the best food they've had. And they assured me it was for the moment. But it was a typical man sort of thing to do, have to ask opinions. And then I realized over a period of time that my mother had been cooking and my wife had been cooking, and they never asked me. And there was me asking them if my cooking was good. And I still do that. When I do cook, I like to get compliments.
How often do you cook?
Perhaps once or twice a week nowadays. Sometimes a bit more than that. If my wife's in Pakistan or something has happened or she's busy doing other things, then I'll cook.
What kind of things?
Oh, there's no stopping me really. So I'll do a fusion. So I'll make shepherd's pie in a Pakistani Indian style with lots of chilies in it. I'll make. The other day, I was in a restaurant in Ilford, and I saw the dish that was served to me, which was keema and chips. And then 2 days later, I made it. I thought I'll just make keema and chips, and it was really nice. Everyone else said it, and I think it was good as well.
Okay, and just one more question about your mum. What was her favourite thing to make or eat?
You see, the food she would really like is not the food I would like. So her big thing was pie, which is goats or lamb's feet. And she would cook that, and it would be like the biggest thing that would happen. It would take a week for her to prepare for this thing, and it would take a whole day to make it. So she didn't rely on any pressure cookers or anything like that. So it would start in the morning and her in the kitchen, and it would end at about 6 or 7 o'clock, where she's made this food, and I wouldn't go near it. But she was fascinated, and she would have all her friends come round, and they just loved it. They just loved it. All I remember, it was just it was like a meat dish which was sticky, but they just loved it. And even now, I mean, my wife cooks it, and all the rest of the family, particularly her brother and other people and her family, they love it. The children, they're not into it.
And you mentioned earlier that like your mum would take the mint from the garden. Did
Yeah.
she grow a lot of things?
Yes, so she always wanted a patch of land. So before when we first arrived, we were always in rented property, so she never had a garden. So when we had our house in 1984, she was given a council house, which had a garden, and it was hard work. We had to do, there was lots of weeds, and we had to get rid of all the weeds, and then we arrived at some sort of soil, and my mother would spend ages and ages, and she would grow spinach, mustard, garlic, ginger, coriander, most of the spices or most of the things, the green things she would grow. And many of her friends would come to the garden and then obviously ask her, and if she wasn't home, they would just take. And what used to happen, I remember one of her favorite friends would come along, and they would take lots of spinach and then leave one spinach through the letterbox to let her know that they've taken the spinach. So my mum would know that no one's been stealing her spinach, it's just her friend who's taken the spinach. So there was an understanding between them with spinach. But other things people used to take as well, so, you know. But she used to use those ingredients for the cooking. It was a shame because I would go to Green Street and get the same things, you know, quite cheap, and not having all the hassle. But she liked having something that she grew herself.
Okay, and was it like a common thing? Did a lot of people grow things?
It was quite common, particularly people who had the advantage of having a garden. Lots of people now have moved towards having a garden but putting it as concrete or something like that. But the traditional garden was very important, just as it is for the British community. I mean, you know, garden for the British community is a very, very big part of their lives, and same for other people from other parts of the world. They like growing things. My parents, my mum particularly, she loved growing things that she could use. I mean, she liked flowers, she liked other things, she liked things that you look for the aesthetics, but mainly things that were practical, that you could just take out of the ground and start using. And she grew quite a lot of it, and it was hard work, but to her it tasted much better. I have to be honest, it does. When you got something really organic, it does taste better, but I never told her that at the time.
Have you ever attempted to grow anything?
We tried, so myself and my wife, we tried to grow certain things in the garden. So tomatoes do grow. Garlic, it's a bit hardy, it needs a bit of an effort. My mum had, well, she didn't have time, but she made time. And now, you know, so I'm second generation. For me, I'm always saying there's not enough time. Well, perhaps there is, but we just haven't got the time to spend that time doing those type of things. And obviously we've come through the advent of computers and Facebook and other things, social media, so we're living in a different type of world. So at that time, even having a phone was, you know, quite a novelty. I remember the age of black and white TV. And when I first saw colour TV, it was like amazing. This is like, you know, nothing is going to happen after that. That's it. That's the end of everything. It was just amazing to see colour TVs. And then seeing cinema was just magic. But having a cinema in your house was just unheard of. You would never even think about it. Having an internet type of system, we wouldn't even have thought about it. It wasn't even in, you know, in our dreams that this is what we would see. But we're seeing it, we're living it, so the world has changed. But we're still seeing the same recipes. Amazingly, some of the recipes that my mother was using, I see them on Facebook. I see them on the web. So there's lots of people who are still around, fortunately, who hadn't collected them, but now people have started to collect those recipes, which is really fascinating. Very, very simple things. Now, if you ask people in Punjab, what do you eat, and they'll say, oh, I have makkei ki roti and saag, just like my grandmother used to make.
Nice. And I guess I wanted to ask you a bit about your wife. So you said she came from Pakistan much
Yes.
later than you did.
Yes.
What kind of things was she used to eating, and how did she find sort of eating in the UK and food? And
Well, I know for one thing she's going to be interviewed later, but what she found here is in Pakistan. So I was married in 1989. Now, if you ask people from the 60s and 70s, and particularly the 50s, they'll say in Pakistan everything during that time was so pure. It was wonderful. It was pure ghee. When you went to the shops to get lentils, it was very pure. People will say the people were more pure. But the food to them was very, very pure. So when my wife came here to the UK in 1989, she saw butter and she saw ghee and she said, this is really pure. This is much better than what we're getting in Pakistan. She saw the packeted dal and the rice more pure, and I'll explain. So in Pakistan and India, when you, particularly in the 70s and 80s, when you go to cook dal or rice, first thing you have to do is you have to get the stones out of the dal, which is a very common thing. And over here, it was packaged in such a way you didn't have to do that. So she said, this is just pure, this is really nice. I don't have to do all that struggling, because she remembered as a child that was her duty, getting rid of all the stones and then washing it again and again. And here it is, it's washed and everything for you. So she wasn't used to that. Getting pure butter was quite a novelty. And she would say, oh, this is the thing that my grandparents used to talk about. So having all these things. So her experience was different. The food, I suppose, is very similar. In some ways, it was very cruel, I suppose, of my mother, because she never actually gave the opportunity for my wife to cook, because she controlled the kitchen. My wife didn't really cook until after my mother had passed away in 2001. So that's when my wife started doing more of the cooking. Or if my wife tried to cook when, for example, my mother was unwell or she was out with her friends, when my mother came back, she would always find fault with it. To be honest, a lot of the dishes my wife cooked were better than my mother's, actually. It's easier to admit now because she's no longer with us. But it was fascinating because the food that my wife could cook, and she could cook much more recipes and much more food than my mum could cook, because she had been taught by her mother, and there was lots of things that she had in her sort of portfolio. There's not a recipe book as such, but in her portfolio, in her mind of what she had cooked before. So she's an amazing cook, and she uses the same spices. She uses some other spices. The garam masala is still made at home. The coriander is still broken at home, although we use a machine. We don't always use the mortar and pestle, although we still have the mortar and pestle. It's not as used as frequently as then, but the traditions have still carried on. So from my mother, and obviously from her mother and her grandmother. So those traditions of South Asian cooking are still very much alive and kicking with us today. I suppose one of the things why they are still alive is very similar to language, for example. So my wife, when she came here, she speaks Punjabi at home, and sometimes Urdu with people from our family, sometimes. Her ability to speak the Punjabi language and then speak to my mother ensured that my children spoke the Punjabi language at home, so they could take that tradition further. And this is the same with the food. That because the food was similar, she could hold on to that food. So now, sitting from 1989 to 2022 now, the food is still probably the same. There might have been some fusion into it. I know my wife does a lot of the Italian and Turkish type of cooking as well. So she, looks at the way they cook, and she watches the programs and tries to copy some of their stuff, which my mother obviously never had the advantage of doing. But the food has developed. It's like, just as language is dynamic, food is quite dynamic. It never goes away. It just changes its shape and becomes something different. As I said to you earlier, I mean, in restaurants, we wouldn't see vindaloo, we wouldn't see chicken tikka masala. That developed later. But it still has its roots back to the old original cooking. And if you ask most people now, if someone was to, apart from a health point of view, if things cooked now, curries cooked in oil or in something which is a bit more healthy compared to cooked in pure desi ghee, are they better? We have to be really honest. Yes, they are much better. They taste really amazing. But health-wise, we have to be much more careful. But the dynamics of the food is that it transcends everything. It moves, and it's always developing. So that's why we arrived at a place that I mentioned earlier. We've got chips and keema. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I think it's going to be more dynamic and more vibrant as more communities come in together. And maybe if you're having this interview in 50 years' time, the food will be really exciting. I'm sure it'll be much more exciting than now, because they'll look at us and say, oh, that was a bit bland, wasn't it?
Okay, and just one more question. What is your favourite thing that your sort of wife introduced to your palate?
Oh, that's an interesting one. She's very experimental, so she'll try Italian dishes. I think the main thing that she really likes is pasta, cooked in a traditional Italian way, and then made Pakistani. And that's quite a unique thing to do. And the great thing is, because I'm sure people from different countries, so if someone is from Nigeria, they'll make pasta the traditional way and then put a bit of Nigerian spirit into it, and suddenly it's something else. So yeah, that's something which is really amazing about my wife's cooking in many ways. But it's a whole journey. The other day I was looking at something which is very, very basic in most people's staple diet, which is this thing called roti. Roti is just round. It's made with chapati flour, sometimes made with plain flour. But you see the roti, when you cook it on the pan, it looks very much like the world. It's like a circle. And as you cook it, the lands start forming, and it looks like the lands of the world, and a map of the world. My mother particularly, she would say that she would often be told off as a child for not making the perfect round roti. And my wife said it's the same. So that whole journey is about, our life journey is like that, it's round. So that's my experience with my wife, with the people I've worked with, people of food. It's always been, the journey is always round.
I think that's a really nice place to end the interview.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You're
that was
welcome. You're
so
welcome.
Interesting.
Thank you.